For 50 years now, climate conferences and negotiations have been going on and on and on, around the world, seemingly not achieving much. And this year, we will reach COP28. But how did we get here? Before I start, this video is actually part 2, so you might want to watch part 1 first. Starting from where we left off, in 2010 at the COP16 in Cancun, the Green Climate Fund is established, with it becoming fully operational in 2016, only 6 years later. Great. Its goal was to raise 100 billion per year by 2020. The OECD's climate funding accounting methodology shows that climate funding in 2020 was around 80 billion a year, thus falling short of only 20 billion. However, their methodology can be contested when it comes to what the actual value should be, since, for example, much of the reported funding comes from loans which are measured at face value or that don't support actual climate projects. 2011, South Africa. The commitment period from the Kyoto Protocol was set to expire by 2012. Thus, the COP17 was one of the last chances to agree on new commitments. Many countries such as Japan, Russia and Canada had made it clear that they would not enter into a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol structure. Therefore, the outcome of the COP17 in Durban was to push the negotiations for a second commitment period to next year, and thus COP out of any action once again. Here we are in 2012 in Doha. An agreement to extend the commitment period until 2020 is agreed, called the Doha Amendment, which is fantastic. Well, it is, if you omit the fact that the remaining participants only account for 14% of global emissions. Also, in order for it to become legal, it needs to be ratified, which took 8 years. In Warsaw at the COP19, the issues of loss and damage were a major focus. This is basically a mechanism to help countries with natural and climate-driven catastrophes. An interesting side note that happened in 2013 was the information leaked by Edward Snowden. This included information that several countries had spied on each other prior to important negotiations, such as at the 2009 Copenhagen Summit. See Part 1. In 2014, the IPCC released its 5th assessment report. This report showed the large differences between a 1.5 and a 2 degree world, as well as what is needed to get to each scenario. 2014 COP in Lima pushed countries to submit their national pledges contributions, commonly known as NDCs or INDCs, before the 2015 agreement. December 2015. The famous Paris Agreement. COP21 in Paris was a somewhat historic conference. The structure of the agreement is different from the previous binding emission reduction targets that were set by the UN. All countries are required to set emission reduction goals, however, countries can choose their own emission reduction targets. Targets are not binding, and countries are encouraged to review and update their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, every 5 years. Also called ratcheting, and to set long-term strategies. The talks also included a pathway to provide finance and build a compliance and monitoring framework. Thus, 195 countries out of 198 signed it,
have a look on the cheese,
with it being ratified only a year later by countries that in total represented 77% of global emissions. The main goal of the agreement is to keep warming to below 2 degrees, with 1.5 being a more ambitious goal. In 2016, a few days after the ratification of the Paris Agreement, COP22 took place in Marrakesh. Sometimes known as the COP of Action, don't ask me why, as it was the conference that tied the loose ends of Paris and started to implement series of actions with a focus on finance. I previously spoke about the different amendments to the Montreal Protocol in Part 1. After more or less 6 years of talks, the legally binding Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol was agreed upon in 2016 at the MOP28. It basically added hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, to the list of controlled substances, as HFCs are powerful greenhouse gases. The reason why this amendment was important is because HFC production was steadily increasing for a number of years as a replacement for the previously banned substances such as CFCs. The agreement plots a gradual 80 to 85% phase out of HFCs by the late 2040s, and thus is generally viewed as a successful conference. It entered into force in 2019 after sufficient countries ratified it. Many high-polluting countries such as China and the US have ratified it quite recently too. In 2017, 1 year after Donald Trump's election, the US and Trump announces its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, including its previous NDCs and contributions to the Green Climate Fund. The withdrawal took official effect in 2020 due to the 3-year notice withdrawal rule. Since the Paris Agreement was a general agreement, the 2017 COP's goal was to nail down the details of implementation, monitoring, and financing the transition. It was also an oceanic COP that had a small focus on oceans and low-lying island states. In 2018, the COP24 at Katowice sets out more detailed rules for the Paris Agreement. In 2018 and 2019, we also saw the IPCC release a special report that showed further evidence of the benefits of limiting global warming in relation to the new goals set in the Paris Agreement. The COP25 in Madrid was the longest conference in record, showing how much governments waffled as not much was achieved. Prior to the conference, many countries were pushing for all to set higher ambitions for their NDCs before 2020, which wasn't achieved. Setting out rules for a carbon market was also on the agenda, but did not succeed. The EU did announce the EU Green Deal, which sets out the changes necessary to make the Union carbon neutral by 2050, which was approved the next year. Also, a project to support loss and damage in developing countries was established here called the Santiago Network. In 2021, countries submitted updated NDCs ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow. The countries that submitted them represented almost 60% of Paris signatories and half of global emissions. Certain high-emitting countries did not submit them before COP26, such as China and India. At the COP, NDCs were the main topic on the agenda. A global methane pledge was also signed by 103 countries to limit methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. In 2022, as the world is a big fan of swimming in denial, COP27 happened in Egypt. The agenda at the 2022 Sharm el-Sheikh COP, similarly to Glasgow, was mainly implementing the Paris Agreement and updating NDCs. An announcement was made to create a fund for loss and damage for developing countries. In 2022, the US rejoins the Paris Agreement, thank F for that. We have finally reached 2023. In 2023, the IPCC released its 6th assessment report, basically telling us stuff we already know but don't care enough to act on. Later in the year, the COP28 will take place in one of the leading green countries and one of the most sustainable places on Earth, the United Arab Emirates. The president of this COP is none other than Mr. Green himself, Sultan Al Jaber, CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Interesting choice. In this video, we have gone through the years in order to understand the history of climate negotiations. I have made this pathway to show an overview of the timeline, as we've gone through many events in part 1 and 2. I couldn't include everything, such as related conferences on biodiversity or energy, because the video would be 3 hours long. However, these are also extremely important and sometimes lack recognition, such as the IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC but for biodiversity. One could also go much further and make an analysis on what makes a successful agreement, climate change game theory, defining what effectiveness really means, how monitoring and verification works. However, I wanted to keep this video series shorter and simpler. In conclusion, I'm sorry to have wasted your time, similarly to how governments and many companies have been wasting ours. After so many years of international negotiations, it all seems like a massive procrastination. Whilst all of these conferences were going on, no time was wasted for ecosystem destruction, wildfires, ice sheets melting, droughts, desertification, floods, ocean acidification, and many more. In the context of goals, the question is, are countries and firms decreasing their emissions in line with a 1.5 or even 2 degree world? Well, not really. Another question to ask is if those two goals are even good. But these are topics for another video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to learn more about climate change and energy, don't forget to subscribe.